Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 113 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today's episode is another solo episode where I share some of my own research with you. This is the story of the military liaison missions in post-war Germany, or the spies in uniform, as I call them. I've covered them a few times on Instagram in the past, and if you're a longtime listener, you might recall episode number 23 when I interviewed Aidan McGee, who participated in these missions himself and wrote a book about it titled Cold War Wilderness of Mirrors. I wanted to give you all a broader overview of the subject today because it was such a unique mission that could only have taken place in a divided Germany caught between the two nuclear superpowers. But before we dive into this story, I want to ask you something. Are you an amateur military historian like me? Has this podcast rekindled your interest in Eastern Europe and the Cold War? Maybe you're finally getting into reenacting and living history, just like you've always said you would. If so, you should check out the incredible collection of surplus military goods at krishiki.com. Kruss himself scours the continent for the best uniforms and field equipment available and delivers them right to your door. He's got almost anything you can imagine and many things you haven't. Uniforms from East Germany, the Soviet Union, and modern-day Bulgaria, Poland, and Russia are all available. Rucksacks, mess kits, and load-bearing gear are also up on the site right now. The inventory is constantly changing, so you never know what kind of gems you might stumble on, all at very affordable prices. Find it all at krishiki.com. That's KRUSCHIKI.com. And use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 for 10% off your order. Beginning in 1947, a fascinating and little-known chapter of the Cold War opened in West Berlin with the establishment of military liaison missions between the United States, Britain, and France on one side, and the Soviet Union and East Germany on the other. What began simply as a means to jointly oversee German military disarmament during the post-war period soon turned into a perilous game of cat and mouse, as uniformed intelligence personnel from both sides pushed the envelope of international relations to collect actionable intelligence on each other, sometimes at the cost of their lives. With the ever-present specter of another world war hanging over the entire region, the military liaison mission was a high-pressure assignment that attracted some of the most capable service members America could produce. The Hübner-Malin Agreement of 1947 allowed for an equal number of liaison personnel from each country to operate in the other's respective zones. The US MLM and the Soviets agreed to allow 14 total liaison team members at any one time. The US Military Liaison Mission had substantially more assigned personnel than this, around 60 normally. But only 14 were ever permitted inside East Germany at any given time, since that was the only place the Soviets could monitor their numbers. The service members assigned to the U.S. Military Liaison Mission did not use many of the classic tools of espionage. There were no dead drops, no disguises, no confidential sources, or high-tech gadgetry. Instead, these courageous and cunning officers and NCOs worked openly, in uniform, known by all sides, to collect information on their adversaries. Their tools were binoculars, cameras, and notepads. Their methods varied from outrunning the East German Stasi in a high-speed chase to offering a bored and lonely Soviet sentry a Marlboro cigarette and some conversation. Their primary mission was to collect actionable intelligence on Warsaw Pact equipment, tactics, operational tempo, and troop movements. They surveilled convoys and training exercises extensively, always on the lookout for a new type of issued equipment, vehicle configuration, or technological modification to the Soviet order of battle. Team members operated in pairs and typically went out on a multi-day mission in East Germany known as a tour. More than 600 tours might be completed in a single year. The team consisted of an officer who was fluent in Russian and a driver, non-commissioned officer, who was fluent in German. Even on short duration tours, the team packed in camping gear, extra food, water, and clothing, along with their intelligence gathering tools. Getting stuck in bad terrain could leave the team stranded for days at a time, so they were prepared to be out much longer than anticipated. Heavy winches allowed them to get their vehicles unstuck on their own, and camouflage netting disguised them once they settled into an observation post. Liaison team members drove heavily modified vehicles intended to give them advantages in all situations. A wide variety of US and European-made vehicles were used over the course of the 40-year mission. Ford Fairlane and Galaxy police interceptors were some of the vehicles of choice at the very beginning of the mission. Then came Ford Broncos, Jeep Wagoneers, and later on Mercedes G-Wagons, all of which were operated by the US MLM. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Shop at the famed Berlin Brigade modified these vehicles for their unique missions. According to Paul Nikula, assigned to the mission from 1959 through 1962, on some of these vehicles, the springs were replaced with heavier-duty station wagon or ambulance springs. Koni shock absorbers replaced the stock shock absorbers from the factory. Quarter-inch thick steel plates were welded in place under the front suspension, under the engine, and under the transmission, as well as underneath the gas tank. German-type tow hooks were welded on the front and rear bumpers, and halogen headlights replaced the stock sealed beams. Additional halogen driving lights were added into the grille. The electrical switches were modified to permit the horn, headlights, parking, and signal lights, and tail or stop lights to be turned off individually, or all except the headlights, with the flip of one switch. The original tires were replaced with Michelin all-terrain radial tires all around. The entire vehicle was then painted a flat olive drab. A draw curtain was installed in the rear window, and the all-terrain capability of some of the later SUV vehicles gave them additional cross-country mobility. In order to accomplish their assigned missions, team members had to be brazen and defiant in the face of their adversaries. While some areas of East Germany and East Berlin were thoroughly off-limits in accordance with international agreements, the game was afoot everywhere else. The missionaries, as they called themselves, were constantly chased and harried by the Soviets and the East Germans, so they had to get creative in order to lose their pursuers and get access to the Soviet convoys and training cantonments that were their primary targets. The mission vehicles were also equipped with 44-gallon extended-range fuel tanks because it was known that at any time The vehicles stopped at a service station in East Germany. The attendant might phone in to the Stasi, who would quickly home in on their location. Retired U.S. Marine Corps Major General Michael Ennis served with the MLM in the early 1980s, by which point the teams were issued night vision goggles and had equipped their Mercedes G-Wagons with infrared headlights. They could effectively disappear in the woods after dark, and Ennis reported that he had driven right past groups of Soviet troops who never even looked up. They would hear an engine nearby, but expressed no curiosity since there was nothing to see. The teams also developed a motorcycle configuration technique, which meant that they shut off all the lights on the right half of the vehicle so that only one headlight and one taillight could be seen, effectively reducing the signature of their vehicle and disguising it to reduce suspicion from posted sentries. Aside from taking photos and videos, missionaries were expert scavengers. Soviets often lost or carelessly left behind valuable tidbits of equipment or information. They frequently combed over bivouac and training sites from which the Soviet Army had recently departed. Their British counterparts, known as bricksmiths, scored 2 enormous intelligence coups by combing over Soviet firing ranges. They discovered a damaged sabot round from a T-80's main gun. The gun crew had been unable to load or fire it properly and discarded it over the side to be forgotten. This was the first round of this type that NATO had gotten its hands on and informed them of the Soviets' anti-armor capabilities at that point. On another occasion, British intelligence officer Dave Butler discovered a half-buried explosive reactive armor box. Explosive reactive armor was top Soviet technology of the time and of tremendous interest to Western intelligence agencies. The ERA box was bolted onto the outside of Soviet tanks to detonate an incoming anti-armor round before it penetrated the primary armor. Its discovery represented an absolute coup for NATO and aided in the redesign of anti-armor tank rounds. Missionaries found continual success with these scavenger strategies because the Soviet soldiers themselves almost never reported items as lost. There were immense consequences in place for anyone who reported the loss of a sensitive item, but inventory oversight was poor enough throughout the Soviet system that there was little chance an item would be discovered missing by higher headquarters on their own. So the Soviet soldiers were thereby deterred from reporting lost equipment or ammunition. Their loss was a missionary's gain. One of the least glamorous aspects of their assignments came about due to supply shortages within the Soviet Army. Toilet paper was never issued to Soviet soldiers, forcing them to use whatever was at hand. According to Mike Ennis, who served with the MLM from 1986 until 1989, missionaries would use gloves and sticks to look at used toilet paper found in the woods. Sometimes they struck gold, as a careless Russian soldier would use a page torn from a code book or classified manual to do his business. No job was too dirty for the missionaries. Hard work and diligence paid off time and time again for the MLM. On one occasion, a Soviet airfield was being constructed in East Germany, and the runway had already been completed, but was not yet under active guard. A missionary team approached in the dead of night with a sledgehammer and broke up some of the runway concrete for analysis. It was determined then that the concrete was of a type that would be resistant to aerial denial cluster bombs used by NATO forces against Warsaw Pact facilities. Separately, Bricksmith members discovered a recently vacated Soviet site with a fire still burning in the center, with some paper documents visible through the flames. In a selfless and risky act, one team member literally dove into the flames to extinguish them immediately with his body. It turned out that the partially burned documents were Soviet cryptological documents. Even in their damaged state, they provided valuable insight into Soviet communications. In 1989, Missionary Sergeant First Class Thomas Favia located and photographed a Soviet Tunguska anti-aircraft vehicle parked in the open by itself. The driver was the only crew member present, and he was asleep inside the vehicle. Once the missionaries realized the vehicle was effectively unguarded, they snuck close enough to take lots of photos and even left a batch of purple wildflowers next to the driver's compartment as a thank you for the intelligence gathering opportunity. You, the listener, might have seen this very photo on my Instagram page a few weeks ago, as a matter of fact. Well, the rewards were high for the military liaison missions, but the risks were even higher. None of the missionaries from any of the services were ever armed at any point during the 40-year mission. This led to high degrees of harassment and varying levels of aggression from Soviet and East German governments. A common tactic on all sides was to blockade a mission vehicle to prevent them from leaving while a determination was made as to the legality of their activities. This was known amongst the Americans as getting clobbered. In most cases, it was as much a rite of passage for missionaries as anything else. Missionaries would be delayed and hassled by Soviet or East German soldiers, and then asked to sign a declaration that they were committing an illegal act. They would refuse to sign the form as expected, and then be let go, losing nothing more than valuable time. This was what normally occurred, but there were many far more serious and even deadly encounters over the years. Between 1975 and 1987, there were at least 20 serious incidents between Warsaw Pact forces and the missionaries. Numerous MLM vehicles were hit by gunfire, and one driver's boot was grazed by a 7.62 millimeter round. In at least one documented incident, the Soviets drugged an MLM officer at a December 1979 party between liaison group members, causing him to crash his official vehicle shortly after leaving the party to return to the MLM headquarters in Potsdam. The MLM hierarchy did not believe the officer, named Major Bill Burhans, when he swore that he had not drunk irresponsibly at the party. Just after navigating the serpentine obstacles on the famed Glenicke Bridge near Potsdam, Burns suddenly lost control of the vehicle, smashing into a civilian bus. Burns and his passenger, Lieutenant Colonel James Tong, were both returned to the United States in disgrace, with their careers ruined. It was not until 40 years later that they would be redeemed, when their full Stasi files were uncovered. Both men had been the targets of active Stasi operations for at least a year before the night of their fateful crash, and had indeed been slipped drugs by someone during the party. Efforts to undermine the liaison missions went both ways, however. In 1981, technical specialists from a U.S. Army Special Missions unit broke into the Opel automobile factory in Russelsheim, West Germany. Their mission was to covertly install microphones and a transmitter in a brand new Opel sedan pre-ordered by the Soviet government personnel. The mission to bug a new Soviet-purchased sedan required weeks of planning and preparation. Its first iteration had begun upon discovery that the Soviets used a particular repair shop in West Germany for servicing their sedans. Overnight, a team from the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command's Quick Reaction Team swapped out the gas tank of a Soviet vehicle with a new one, fitted with a tracking device. The Quick Reaction Team had just been established the year prior and was composed of personnel who specialized in technical surveillance countermeasures and who provided support to intelligence collection activities worldwide. The next opportunity came when a Soviet liaison officer ordered a new Chevy for himself via automobile sales at the U.S. Army's post-exchange system. This purchase was authorized as part of the 1947 agreement, and Soviet officers frequently purchased U.S. goods at the on-base post-exchanges. Technicians from the QRT back in the U.S. installed tracking devices before the Chevy ever left the Detroit factory. The final phase of the so-called Operation Lanky Miss was to gain access to every single official vehicle of the 14-man Soviet Military Liaison Mission unit in West Berlin. An employee at the Opel factory was recruited by U.S. Army personnel to facilitate their mission. The employee arranged for them to have overnight access to one of the vehicles ordered by the Soviets and bribed on-site security personnel to avoid the area and turn a blind eye to visitors. Knowing that the Soviets routinely swept their vehicles for bugs, the team had to install the microphones and transmitter in the frame itself, which would require a complete disassembly of the vehicle for detection. The installation team practiced on a used Opel, reducing the time required for the installation from 20 hours down to 11 hours or less, which was a time frame that would allow them to complete it overnight after the workers had gone home. The mission was an apparent success. Eventually, more than a dozen Soviet vehicles were bugged, allowing for the identification of numerous Soviet agents and the breaking of several communication codes in the early 1980s. Since then, however, there has been speculation that the Soviets may have deliberately allowed their vehicles to be accessed by U.S. intelligence personnel as a means to learn more about the current state of U.S. surveillance technology, and possibly to identify some of the personnel involved. Because audio devices of the era transmitted via either radio waves or physical recordings, U.S. personnel either had to follow at a reasonably close distance to receive the transmissions in real time, or routinely access the vehicles to retrieve the recordings, which seems far less likely. So it's entirely possible that Lanky Miss was nothing more than a dangle operation by Soviet intelligence. I think that's why they call it the Cold War wilderness of mirrors. Over the years, the Soviets developed a technique for deniable sabotage of the NATO liaison missions. When an identified mission vehicle was passing a Soviet convoy, one of the large ZIL trucks would simply turn and smash into the small sedan or SUV, disabling it and injuring or even killing the occupants. The Soviets would immediately claim that there had been a tragic traffic accident due to careless MLM drivers. Many U.S., British, and French vehicles were severely damaged or totaled in this manner. In 1984, French liaison officer Major Philippe Mariotti was killed by a large East German truck. Stasi documents uncovered after the dissolution of East Germany by historian Matthias Heissig prove that Mariotti's death was a targeted murder. The Stasi carefully tracked Mariotti's movements and placed heavy trucks in waiting around the French liaison's barracks. On March 22, 1984, the trap was sprung. Mariotti and two other French liaison officers were driving in a Mercedes 280E sedan on their way to observe a large military exercise involving Soviet and Polish troops. Just as they were passing the barracks of the East German 11th Motorized Rifle Division, a Ural 375 6x6 truck and trailer pulled in front of the Mercedes to block the way. Mariotti braked to a stop, but then another Ural 375 slammed into the back of the Mercedes and pushed it underneath the first truck. Mariotti was killed immediately, and Captain Jean-Paul Staub was severely wounded. Chief Warrant Officer Blanchiston was slightly injured as well, but refused medical treatment and refused to leave the scene. Mariotti's body was trapped in the vehicle and couldn't be extracted for over an hour by responding firefighters. Meanwhile, a lot of the French equipment, including maps, radios, and paperwork, was stolen by the East German troops and Stasi agents involved. Several hours later, French forces and ambulances arrived to take the three men back to their base. The Stasi launched an aggressive disinformation campaign immediately following the crash, claiming Mariotti had been driving drunk and demanding compensation for the damage done to their vehicle. However, because of the intense diplomatic protests by the French government, the Stasi concluded that in the future they would need to be more nuanced and subtle in their efforts to sabotage and undermine the NATO liaison missions. Nevertheless, the documents that were uncovered by Heisig years later showed that 9 soldiers and agents who were involved in Mariotti's death received awards and cash bonuses for the successful operation. One of the greatest intelligence coups of the entire 40-year mission may also have ultimately been one of the costliest. In the early morning hours of January 1st, 1984, Major Arthur D. Nick Nicholson and his team scouted and successfully entered a Soviet tank shed containing the new-to-service T-64B main battle tank variant. They likely took advantage of nearby Soviet personnel relaxing their security posture to celebrate the New Year. The team had unfettered access for 24 hours, an almost unbelievable triumph. Photos taken from inside the tank confirmed that it was capable of firing missiles and was equipped with a laser rangefinder. These photos were widely distributed among the NATO intelligence community and appeared the following year in the US MLM Official History Guide. Nicholson was considered one of the most productive and capable of all missionaries. This incident undoubtedly put him on the Soviet GRU's radar. Although it did not come to light until many years later, it appears that Nicholson may have been betrayed and named to the Soviets and East Germans by James Hall, a U.S. Army warrant officer who had begun aiding them in 1983. When finally caught and sentenced in 1989, Hall confessed to having provided the details of Nicholson's intelligence coup to his handlers. What did they do with that information? We don't know. What we do know is that 15 months later, on March 24th, 1985, Major Nicholson and his driver, Staff Sergeant Jesse Schatz, followed a Soviet T-80 MBT convoy returning from training exercises. At the Soviet encampment, they realized that there were no visible sentries posted. Nicholson exited their Mercedes G-Wagon and attempted to repeat history by moving to an apparently uninhabited tank shed to look inside. At that moment, a Soviet sentry moved out of the tree line and raised his rifle. His first round missed Major Nicholson as he turned and raced for the safety of the G-Wagon. The next round struck him in the chest, and he fell, mortally wounded. Staff Sergeant Schatz attempted to exit the vehicle with a first aid kit to render aid, but the sentry forced him back into the vehicle as more soldiers swarmed in from all sides. Major Nicholson slowly bled to death as the Soviets debated what to do. Nicholson's death created an international crisis as both sides recognized what a major escalation it represented. The Soviets and East Germans went to work immediately sowing disinformation, as they always did. They claimed that Nicholson had been the aggressor, that he was trespassing in a forbidden area, and that they had acted in self-defense. U.S. diplomats called for a congressional investigation and sanctions against the Soviets. Ultimately, the incident cooled down, and no one was held responsible for Nicholson's death, whether it was murder or manslaughter. Nicholson was buried with full honors in Arlington National Cemetery. The Soviet Union officially apologized for his death in 1988, and in 2005, a memorial was erected at the site of his death near Ludwigslust, Germany. Nicholson would be the last official American casualty of the Cold War. The NATO military liaison missions persevered after Nicholson's death for another 5 years, delivering up-to-the-minute intelligence on Warsaw Pact forces' readiness. As the Cold War wound down, the Soviet Union's hold over East Europe weakened. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall was finally opened, and freedom rang through the formerly separated districts of Berlin. Over the coming months, the missionaries turned their focus to observing the orderly withdrawal of Soviet forces from East Germany through Poland. Finally, on October 3rd, 1990, the two Germanys were officially reunified. That same day, the military liaison mission was disbanded. The missionaries went on to face new, emerging threats through different postings worldwide. Almost to a man, however, they unanimously reported that their tours with the military liaison mission were the best, most important, most dangerous, and most exciting times of their careers and their lives. Their accomplishments were decisive, and their sacrifices were unforgettable. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram, at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around, because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.